Hi everybody, Tim Hughes here. I'm the CEO and co-founder of DALL-E Ignite. Today we've got Ed Fowler, and we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence, what your CEO needs to know about artificial intelligence. Before we get in, I always ask my guests to introduce yourself and say where can people find you?
Fantastic. I'm Ed Fowler. People can get hold of me in my LinkedIn profile. It's very open. It's very easy to get hold of me. And that's probably the best place to find me at the moment, I think.
Okay. So just give us some background in terms of because you're a CTO, Chief Technology Officer. And your background is I think you even call yourself a geek. You're a big fan of sci-fi fiction. Where is it that you can in effect talk with authority on what AI is and stuff like that?
So I've been kind of working with data, essentially, because AI grows from data for the last 30 years. I fell into it, was asked to pick up some projects very early on in my career, sorting out paperwork as it was at the time. And then following that through a translation for when what became digital was moving away from just digitizing content and forms into let's analyze the content, let's do something with it, and then let's draw inferences from what we find. And that's the basis of AI. I've been in the industry for about 30 years in the same sort of space. I've changed domains quite a lot. But the primary thing is I've been speaking and thinking about ways to draw non-obvious inferences from data for a long time, be it from fraud or risk. And the latest versions of AI essentially build on that. They've started off as simplistic models of neural networks and have now become quite evolved versions, and the sort of evolutionary journey has matched my own. So I've built AI networks, I have implemented them in corporate life and in games, but I've also had to work with them and try and make sense of them as well and what they're coming out from. So it's been a companion state as to how I come from.
Because you've actually in your previous role, you actually worked with AI within in effect a corporate role, weren't you?
Yes.
So this is not like an ivory tower thing. You've
No,
actually
no,
been
no.
using it.
AI is very tangible and real. Whether it's from something like virtual makeup, where like a filter comes on and applies different things so you can see what you look like, to being able to analyze the likelihood of fraud in a particular transaction. Those are AI-like behaviors. They're based on machine learning. They're not just a direct line if then or. The difference with the modern ones is they are now more publicly available. They're not just now plugged into a specific business purpose. They're now much more available for people to experiment with and innovate.
So in terms of, so if we fast forward to use something like ChatGPT, which is something that everybody kind of, unless you've been under a rock, most people have heard of it. Where are we in terms of that being AI? Because I see stuff all the time where basically ChatGPT is going to take my job, and how real is that?
Well, I think it's probably a good idea to step back and say, what is ChatGPT?
Yeah.
ChatGPT 3.5 is the one they released, and now ChatGPT 4 are extremely large, complicated things called large language models, which essentially are two parts. There's been an evolutionary journey as how to analyze text. It starts with a simple neural network, which tried to predict what the next word was.
Okay.
I have a sentence prediction, and that ran into a problem because it couldn't remember the beginning of a sentence. So if you went I used to live in Germany, and that's why I'm fluent in, it wouldn't know that the word should be German. It would go, I don't know, Dutch. So they started building tools and techniques that would make it more and more recursive, that would allow it to assemble a larger block of text into it. And you needed to train that against something. So in the case of ChatGPT, they have trained it against truly vast amounts of text data, like everything that was scanned, like every email that's been going on. These are genuinely vast models.
Yeah.
And then the second part of it is the filter stack, which tops it being rude, because all of the data you treat it on has some massively problematic things, because human beings are problematic.
Because we've had all these things in the past where, was it Microsoft put that thing on Twitter, didn't it? And then it started
rapidly
saying that Hitler was actually really good, that sort of thing.
So what they've done is they've stuck a filter on top of it. Now, the original filters were just very deterministic. It was like, don't say this, don't say that, a list of banned words. The modern ones are self-learning. So it's essentially what we have now in ChatGPT is this is an AI sitting on top of an AI.
Right.
Both learning and collaborating. And it's a complex stack. There's a lot of engineering underneath it. There's a huge amount of training data. And now there's the filters themselves are being looked at in terms of should they be more self-learning, machine learning type models as well. So ChatGPT at the moment is, you go to a website, you register for an account, you might want to pay for it, you don't, and you ask it questions, and it can interact in a very human-like way. For ChatGPT 4, Microsoft has recently published a paper with a bunch of its researchers to go, actually, there are some emergent behaviors of something what they call artificial general intelligence.
Right.
Now, an AI at the moment is, it will predict the next words that come out of a sentence, and it will remember a conversation several paragraphs back and try and compare that conversation with patterns of text it's seen elsewhere. It doesn't really create. It assembles something, and it can.
It's basically, as you're saying, it's basically trying to predict the next word.
Essentially, but it can now do it in really powerful means. So if you say to it and go, write me a really abstract topic, give me the outline of a 1,500-word article on the Napoleonic war paintings of Goya, it will give you a structure that, and you go, actually, yeah, this isn't controversial enough. Put in there something about whether it was him or his son-in-law. It will give you that one. But it's not really creating, it's finding stuff out. Now, the problem that it has is if it doesn't know an answer, the way it's been structured, it just makes something up.
Right.
So if you say, can you give me a bunch of references for it? There are no references. But it makes up a bunch of references to try and please, and not in a way that's pleasing, to try and fulfill the question you've asked it. It will very rarely say no unless you hit something that's in the filter.
Which is why when I've seen these programs on TV, which is where someone asks ChatGPT, are you lonely? And ChatGPT says, I'm lonely.
Yeah,
because all it's doing is it's replaying back to you kind of what you've said.
To a degree. I mean, it has the ability to look into the vast collection of data for some genuinely interesting stuff, but it's not really creating anything new yet. There may be inferences, though, in ChatGPT 4, which is the latest version, that it can start to create if you give it certain tools. And it has certain behaviors you can program in which look very interesting. The difference between an artificial intelligence is kind of just one use case. An artificial general intelligence, it can do lots of things. And if you give it tools, it can start to do some more stuff. Now, it's going to be a huge change. A lot of jobs are going to be impacted. There's a study that came out over the weekend from Goldman Sachs.
Yes.
Globally, 300 million jobs will be impacted in some degree or other. That's broadly the number of jobs that were impacted by the digital transformation we just kind of tailored off on. This is going to happen a lot faster because, unlike in the digital translation, which had a lot of work that had to go into build primary systems and then protocols and then X, Y, Z, these tools are out there. You could start plugging them into nearly anything. And where they're being used at the moment is like a digital gold rush. People are doing the good. People are panning for gold. They're losing a prime resource, and that impacts certain forms of creative industries, certain forms of low-level industries, not in terms of low level, but sort of entry points to industries. So, for example, basic legal tasks, contractual analytics, some forms of content creation, some forms of marketing creation. Those it can do quite well. But there's a next stage that's coming, and that's where it's going to get quite important because these things are going to get plugged in further and further down the stack inside an enterprise, and they're going to move away from just looking at simple content creation into now making some pretty profound decisions based upon what it does. And that could be smart business processes start coming out, smart analytics. And now with what Microsoft is implying that they're going to do with something called Copilot, which is embedding ChatGPT inside the Office stack, Office 365, that starts getting quite profound. I mean, you can type into the chat and it will create you a remarkably complicated spreadsheet.
Because you pointed out that in 1985 we had such a thing called a clerical worker.
Yeah.
We had such a thing. I know people probably won't believe this, but there was this world before the internet, even before computers, where there were these things called word processors, and people typed even letters, sent letters. But by 1995, they'd all gone.
I mean, I remember entering corporate life in the late 80s, and around me was tons of paper.
Yeah.
Now, it took a while to get the paper out, but an awful lot of the people whose job was just to look after the paper went remarkably rapidly.
But their jobs, those jobs didn't go, but those people went and did other things.
Absolutely, they became other things. People became knowledge workers. People became project managers. People became business analysts. Essentially the same skills of information collation, analytics, and creative conclusion drawing. Those were all there. The slight difference with this transformation over the previous one is some of the things that people go back on, which is using experience gained from a long productive life solving simple problems, and now this can really do. So this has got some massive upside to it. Some of the challenges and problems we can now address are vastly easier to address with tools like this. You can make much more complex systems of engagement or differentiation with a person. You can solve some more complex problems. You can massively cut through any remaining bureaucracy. The downside is it's going to impact some of the learning pathways we use to train people to become better leaders. So people start at entry-level jobs in many industries. Those are doing relatively repetitive work, which could be done by a machine, just hasn't been yet. And those jobs are there effectively to provide learning and teaching us how people can become effective leaders later on. Those learning pathways are directly impacted. So as we said before, what we're at the moment is panning for gold, and there's people prospecting and looking out for new things. The second level will be, well, there's some massive changes going to happen in terms of our leadership, ownership, and effectively training pathways, learning pathways. That's going to be impacted. But there's going to be some other new jobs come across. So we've seen some of the obvious ones like prompt engineering. How can I engineer a prompt to ChatGPT to try and make something interesting? They're flash in the pan. But there's some profound stuff about knowing what your AI does and where it came from that most businesses have never even considered. This idea of having to know what a training data would look like, what implicit biases are inside that training data, what the filter mechanisms are to stop it doing something unusual to a customer, because it can massively impact your brand if you have a machine that is generating potentially thousands of responses a day, an hour maybe.
As we saw when Google put up that,
and it was wrong.
That slide that they'd used Bard, and the answer was wrong. And what did it knocked? Was it $1 billion, $1.5 billion off their share price or something?
More like 20%.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So one of the things is corporations are going to have to start investing time in this. Now, at the moment, they're talking about ethics as if it's relatively arbitrary. They know it's important at a sort of philosophical level at the board. And they tend to appoint somebody who maybe lives in the legal compliance regulatory world and kind of acts like an audit across business processes. We've got some processes we'll put together. Every so often we look at our businesses and go, yeah, that's good, no, that's bad. And there'll be some guidelines we put together if they're quite mature. The speed this is moving, that's not going to be sufficient. Organizations are going to get into, how do I test ethical behaviors every time a new business process is released, every time I put a new experience out to my customers, almost every time I create a communication that I haven't personally written. How do you do it? Because at the moment, those ethical behaviors we wrap them up in things called culture and training and onboarding and recruitment and talent acquisition, etc. That's all going to be condensed down to who understands how this business process works at a genuinely fundamental level that is obscure. Now that, again, that's only relatively mature, because essentially that's a form of test. We're going to embed it in business processes as a test. You can't get out into the real world until you've tested it somewhere. That still leaves you quite open because it's not really building ethics in as a foundational level. You're going to have to get to some form of ethics architecture fairly rapidly on, which may report up into a board level role that doesn't exist now, like a chief ethics officer, who would combine stuff from legal regulatory compliance, would combine stuff from the data office, would combine stuff from the CIO world. Because as I mentioned back with the implications of what Microsoft are going to put inside Microsoft, an awful lot of business logic can now just be done by a business leader at the click of his fingers or her fingers.
I mean, this idea that you've got the Excel Copilot where you just say, I want this particular spreadsheet, and it builds it for you.
Yeah, that's massive.
Is massive. And I said this to my partner, who kind of does a job which is anti-Excel. And I said, well, it has two implications. One, it actually doesn't get rid of your job, because what it does is that it will explode the amount of Excel that's being used around the organization.
And it'll be
unauditable calculations going on.
And there's also an even more profound thing from that. At the moment, business leaders pay an awful lot of money to IT.
Yeah.
But they're still separate in most places, to provide business logic that's too difficult to do. And then there's a tension between IT, who makes these big corporate enterprise systems, and something called business managed systems or even user generated systems. All of that business logic is kind of owned by the CIO because it's big and expensive and difficult to create. Well, it's not anymore. You can just press a button and create something. Now, for 95% of use cases, that might be completely sufficient. But it's now going to put a massive pressure on the CIO to understand what's going on with that data, to start stopping adverse problems. But also it's going to face challenges as the business guys go, well, why am I paying all this money when I can just do it here? What am I getting on top of this? And that's going to be profound. Because
I mean, that cloud started that, didn't it?
Yeah.
But the CIOs very quickly got their arms around it.
Because they control the money. Because
but the thing is if we think about cloud, it took 5 years for cloud to catch on. ChatGPT's taken what, 5 months?
If that. And it's already inside businesses. And at the moment Microsoft releases this into the wild at scale, there's going to be huge, profound things. I mean, one of our other topics was talking about the sustainability impact of this.
Yes.
The computational overload of this is huge. Now, there's a direct monetary cost for it. Even paid for accounts on ChatGPT, you're limited to how many clicks you can have. And Microsoft are scaling up huge amounts of factories to build data engines that can cope with it.
We in effect need quantum computing, don't we?
Quantum computing is not necessarily any more energy efficient.
Okay. No, but I mean in terms of the computer power.
Oh, it's absolutely. I mean, this is geometrically more power because.
But as you say, that when you get computer power, that requires electricity, that requires coal or oil or gas or whatever to be burned in.
All the public cloud providers say they're carbon neutral.
Yeah,
it's mostly through offset.
Yeah.
They're not sitting there with we only compute where the sun's shining or where there's wind. They don't. They compute wherever it's handy, and therefore they pretend to offset it some ways. This is a huge impact. So if you're a CEO who, say, made a commitment to carbon management, this is now another vector which you previously could have probably ignored IT as maybe a branding error. You can't anymore. If it's everywhere through your business and all of your machines are generating stuff, this is extreme complexity that has to be handled in some way. You've either got to get some pretty good econometrics to try and report on how much carbon you're generating or even indeed how much money you're spending. But also then you're going to have to get it to the point where you understand the decisions these things are making, because this directly impacts your business, either in terms of your computer output talks to a customer and then makes them offended or gives them the wrong advice, to the point where it actually might get to the point where you rely on it to make some really important decisions about perhaps your investment strategies or perhaps about what's going to happen in a particular case for somebody in a medical care. These are all going to be front and center decisions that corporates really aren't set up for at the moment.
So if we take AI today, fast forward 10 years, what's the future going to look like? Because, what's the future?
Well, let's have a case in point. At the moment, if I, even in the best design systems in the world, go from an idea through to some design systems, through to an engineers doing some work, through to people testing it, and then eventually getting released, called the sort of cycle time. That can be up to 3 months, 6 months, a year in some organizations. Expect that in 10 years to be click the moment the design is happy. That's literally just pushed all the way through. The fact is that one person will be able to design something profoundly different is going to be radically different as well. So instead of me needing hundreds of designers, maybe I only need 10 really good designers. But also the fact is that our expectations are going to change as consumers. At the moment, I arrive at, say, Amazon or Tesco's, and the site looks pretty much the same as it did yesterday. If my wife uses it, it looks pretty much the same as mine does. There's absolutely no reason for that to happen. The site will look radically different because they will infer my purpose. They will change the experience radically. And that means the way I interact with everything is radically going to be different. Inside the corporation, well, I won't be relying on large back-end systems to make complex decisions. I'll be just asking the machine in front of me to do that. And the generative experiences and such that I will be able to personalize my experience that will follow around with me to completely. So this AI won't be just sitting on some ChatGPT thing inside of it. There'll be open source models that live on my phone, and they'll be able to interpret what I want. They'll be able to act semi-independently. They'll be able to act as my banker, act as my accountant, in some cases act as my as a relationship or friendship advisor. Everything is going to be different because there is this going to be wave of pseudo intelligence that's going to be supporting us in every aspect of our lives. Now that's going to increase some digital have and have nots. It's going to put some strain on some infrastructures we have. It's going to challenge an awful lot of very pat systems we put to place. And some areas are going to react badly. I mean, some areas that have been protected by hundreds of years of professional quality are going to say, well, no, this can't happen. But those are going to challenge those sort of models of advisory, of advice, of simplistic understanding, of diagnostics, because these things are just going to be there, and they're going to be able to create every experience. And thirdly, what's going to happen is trust is going to be very different. Trust is going to be vastly more important. You will not be able to trust everything you see.
Yeah.
Potentially, you may be able to trust very little, because if it's in an unregulated channel, like a social channel or just something you find on the internet, that could have been generated that very second, and it could be presented in images, words, contexts, which are exceptionally believable, but aren't real. So there's going to be, how do we get news? How do we get entertainment? How do we generate relationships? Are all going to be changed by this, some greater and some worse. But this is a more profound change than digital transformation was. And that took 30 years. It's more profound than cloud. It combines everything we've done for the last several hundred years and is going to collapse it down to 10 years. The outcome is going to be extremely difficult to predict.
Ed, thank you so much for coming on. We've had one comment from, I think it's Lisa, that she says that you're an exceptionally brilliant executive and leading global thought leader.
Well, this is extremely complimentary. Thank you very much.
and I totally agree with her. I think that she absolutely. I mean, what you've proved today is that you really understand the subject. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing.
Thanks for having me.
Been really excited to hear your view on it, because it's very different from what I'm reading in the press. Because the press, I don't know whether they're churning the articles out from ChatGPT. Maybe that's one of the things we have to start learning. But the stuff that I'm reading in the press wasn't exciting me.
It's slightly depressing. There's an awful lot of doom mongering.
Yes,
I think the future is an awful lot more optimistic than that. This has huge benefits for us all.
Yes, like I was reminded that there was it Goldman Sachs that came out with that research that said that it's going to impact 300 million jobs. And yes, it probably will do. But if we look at the IT industry, what the IT industry did was actually generate jobs.
Oh, this is going to create more work and more wealth for humanity in general than any big change we've had before. But it's going to impact some people who have had a predictable future.
Yes,
that's going to change, and that's going to be painful for some. But in general, the upside is going to be huge.
And I think that one of the things that it impacts is the fact that there are a number of people, especially my generation, Generation X, who are in leadership, who grew up outside of the internet age, who probably even grew up without computers. When I was at school, there wasn't a computer until it was the clever people that were given the computers. So I didn't have access to it. Ironically, I then went and worked in IT. But there's going to be just as much as there's digital poverty, there's also going to be AI poverty. And one of the things that we've got to be really careful about, which is going back to the chief ethics officer that you talked about earlier on, is that we all make sure that everybody's brought along on this journey, that those that want to come along.
Absolutely. I mean, just even a simple stuff is most of the interaction with ChatGPT is in English. That's going to radically change because more people are going to be putting it in. But primarily, most of the interaction with ChatGPT is in English because English is what it's been mostly trained on. It hasn't been trained on pictographic languages as much. It doesn't really understand non-linear languages. So there's a huge amount of basic stuff we're going to have to get right to make sure that there aren't AI have-nots or intelligence droughts or intelligence poverty. In the same way as clever regulation is going to have to come out. Now, I was very heartened to say today that the British government released its AI white paper on AI regulation, and they've adopted quite a light touch model, which talks to fundamentals rather than a series of prescriptive outcomes. And that produces an interesting regulatory tension between the UK and the EU, which possibly reflects some very, very fundamental philosophies. But there's going to be a huge area of evolution in how these things are regulated, and indeed how successful regulation is, because most regulation is back to the original sort of audit post facto model we have now. They've got to get ahead of the game.
And Nigel Kirkman says, thank you very much for your insight as well.
Thank you, Nigel. Wonderful.
So Ed, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you.
Remind people where they can get hold of you.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, folks. If you want to grab me, please reach out. Thank you very much.
Okay, fantastic. And thank you again for coming on and talking about this and providing, I think, a very different aspect to certainly what I'm reading in the press around AI. And there's a number of things that I think, questions that you've posed to us around the ethics, the chief ethics officer, the environmental impact, the carbon impact, and all of these things, which are all questions I think that we need to grapple with.
Fantastic, Tim. Great to have. Thank you to have me.
Thanks so much, Ed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.